to the Alliance Center, the hub of sustainability in Colorado. I'm Anna Zavisha. I'm the Executive Director at the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado. We own and operate the center. So this is a place, okay? This is a place for all of us to be able to come together and have these types of conversations. So tonight's event is actually part of the sustainability series, or what we like to call S squared. This is something that's been going on for about 4 to 5 years. Has anybody here not attended a sustainability series before? We got some newbies in the house. Fantastic, well, welcome. Part of the sustainability series is to really talk about the most exciting, important events around sustainability that are happening in our backyards. And this is a partnership between the Alliance, the Worth Chair, Net Impact, and the Posner Center. So it takes a village to put this on, and we're glad you're here. By the way, this is the biggest one I've ever been to. It's huge. We're almost at 200. So, yeah. The next one will be bigger because we have a venue for 500, I just heard. So, part of the Alliance's Hub program is to put a megaphone on some of the most important issues of our time. And up until earlier today, I thought that was the Encyclical, right? That's all everybody was talking about. Well, we got trumped. And not Donald Trump. But we did. We heard about the Clean Power Plan. And so, yes. We already know that the final rule that was released is actually more stringent than what was proposed. And as a teaser, I saw him earlier. Sean McGrath was here in the house. He's still, there he is. He has already committed to us to be back here in a couple of weeks to talk about what's really in that rule. So now he's nodding his head, he will be here, so we'll do another one of these to delve into the Clean Power Plan. But for now, we know we have the final rule. Tonight we're going to focus on the Encyclical. This is one of those things that if you are kind of subscribed to some of the news channels I'm subscribed to, it feels like that's all we've been hearing about. And I shouldn't say this out loud, but I will. As a Catholic who gave up Catholicism for Lent a couple of years ago, I've heard some other Catholics say that this Pope is bringing them back. And I have that same feeling. Yes, it's amazing, right? Pope Francis, he got my vote. So we're going to hear tonight from a great panel, Interfaith panel, some of their thoughts. Danny Orth, where are you? There you are, in our office, worked diligently, tirelessly to put this panel together. We did lose somebody today. We were supposed to have Rabbi Brian Field with us. He had an injury. So you will not get the Jewish perspective. I'm sorry for any Jews in the house, but I think the other religions here are well represented. And we're going to talk about what the Pope is asking us to do, which is really to have a dialogue. This wonderful panel is going to be moderated by Bill Ritter. Probably needs no introduction, right? Yeah. Right. But there are certain things you might not know that I'm just going to highlight briefly. So he's an incredible force, right? He's working on this clean energy economy. He's been running around the western United States, connecting across the aisle all political persuasions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Fantastic. He was also our 41st governor, served only one term, unfortunately. And during that time, he signed 57 clean new energy bills into law. One of those being a 30% RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. So huge, huge accomplishments under Bill Ritter's administration. But you might not know, he is a practicing Catholic. And what else you might not know is that he actually played a role in the writing of the Encyclical. So I'm hoping he might touch on that a little bit. So we've got a great program. The last thing I want to say is, please, if you have a cell phone, turn it off or turn it to silent. We want to give these folks the attention that they need. At the very end, Danny from our office will come up to talk to you about the September Sustainability Series. But for now, let's give a nice warm welcome to Bill Ritter.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate it, and it's really great to be here, and actually fantastic to see such a wonderful crowd. I would say, Anna, the one thing you don't get to do in the Catholic Church is vote on who the Pope is. So don't return to do that, okay, because that's not something that they allow yet. I would say this Pope will be my favorite Pope the day he allows women to become priests. So it's an overstatement to say I was involved in the drafting, but I do want to talk a little bit about encyclicals and about some of the things that I was able to do to intersect with the Vatican in the rollout of the encyclical. An encyclical is something that a Catholic Pope writes, and they are sparing. There aren't many that are done over the time or the tenure of the Pope. There are some that are very famous in the Catholic faith, and this is the second encyclical that Pope Francis has authored, and that the Vatican has authored. There's some really important parts of this. It's the first encyclical ever to deal in any way with the environment, out of all the encyclicals in the history of the Church. The word encyclical actually means, it's Latin for circle, and it means really to circulate, to send around to the churches of the world. It's typically written to the bishops and the priests of the world, so that they can use it as part of their own teaching of Catholics. This encyclical by the Pope was authored, and at the beginning it says, this is not for bishops and priests, this is to all humanity. It's a really important thing. It's a departure from historical tradition in the Catholic faith for a Pope to say, I'm not going to limit this. The second or third thing that's really, I think, important about this is it's one of the few encyclicals that actually deals with a question of science. There will be a part of it we'll talk about where it's a mixture of science and faith that the Pope is inviting us to dialogue about, but he deals with science. And even though it deals with a scientific question, another thing that's a really important foundational element of this is the Pope has pontifical councils. When he's going to write an encyclical, he'll assign a pontifical council to write the encyclical. And in this case, it would have been natural for the Pope to have assigned this to a science and technology pontifical council. He didn't. He assigned it to his peace and justice pontifical council. And that demonstrates that the Pope's view of this, and I think the Vatican's view of this, is really that this is more than a question of science, Mitch McConnell notwithstanding. It's more than a question of science, it's about something much deeper than that. And we'll talk a little bit about what that deeper part is as we visit about it. My part in it was to go there after the encyclical had been drafted. A group from Rome, so it's the Rome Forum, the Italy Foundation, and Mikhail Gorbachev's Green Cross Foundation put together an international delegation of about 20 people. And interestingly, I was the only American that was a part of that, and so in a sense almost became an apologist for what we don't do in the United States of America at the federal level watching Congress. But I had this opportunity then to interact with the other members of the international delegation, and as well with people who were authors of the encyclical, and with the Vicar General to the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, and every bishop throughout the country has a Vicar General. And so we were really talking to the number 2 person. He's a Monsignor Zuppi in Rome. And so we were with him, but also with people who authored the encyclical. And our role is really to sort of back the play of the Pope and help with what I would call, from a political perspective, a rollout strategy. You know, we were asked to really send a document that talked about how important this issue is from the perspective, certainly of the environment, in climate change, but also from the perspective of sort of the world as it relates to economic systems, as it relates to biosphere, and to really make the point that Paris in December, conference in Paris, COP21, is a point in time that can't be missed as our last best chance to act in a serious way. If you saw the president today, he quoted a former governor who said, "We're the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last generation to really be able to do something about it." And if you think about the historical COPs since Rio 20 years ago, and look at sort of the inaction in many respects and the need for action during that time period, we're now at a point in time where there's a greater urgency than there's ever been. This is not fool's play at all anymore. We must act and act now. And that was our role at the delegation. So it is about climate change and global warming, but there's an important part to this. People think the encyclical is just about that. It's not about that at all. And if you haven't read it, I would invite you to read it because it's the worldview, I think, that the Pope and the people inside the Vatican who were part of his leadership really have about this issue, but also really about a variety of things that he would call integral ecology. When we hear the word ecology, we often just think nature or natural systems. That's not what this Pope is talking about when he wrote this encyclical. He's talking about an integral ecology that is about natural systems, but it's about human beings as a part of those natural systems and not as dominant of those natural systems. Which is a really important point as well, because there can be this debate even in faith circles about our relationship to nature and whether we're dominant or whether we're a part of it and share it and have a stewardship role with respect to natural systems. And for the purposes of the encyclical, the Pope at least puts to rest his view of that, which is this is about our being stewards. And he would say we're not very good stewards. And he uses a pit of filth to describe our waste management. He describes different kinds of consumerism, the way we consume and produce energy, but also the way we consume and produce goods, to be impactful on natural systems, and really to be apart from what our role is. He talks about an ecological debt that the North owes the South. And I can imagine he's going to appear in Congress in a joint session on September 24th, and I can imagine him saying this, and how people in the audience who are members of Congress in the United States are going to squirm to think about an ecological debt. Now, we are a great country where philanthropy is concerned and where foreign aid is concerned, but on this issue, in thinking about climate change and warming, the impact on the environment, our stewardship role, the rest of the world looks at the United States, and particularly paying attention just to Congress, thinks we're failing in a very significant way. There's no political institution in the world that's still debating climate change or warming, except the United States Congress. And this is a point that was brought home again and again in Italy. I didn't have to buy drinks, thankfully, but it was really brought home in a pretty significant way. The world's poor is on the mind of this Pope. And interestingly, the head of the Pontifical Council for Peace and Justice is a man named Cardinal Turkson, and he's Ghanaian. And there's very much a Southern Hemisphere perspective about the impact of our own actions and the impact of our action on the poorest of the poor in the world. And the fact that the people that will get hit first and possibly get hit worst, if there's nothing done to curb warming, to curb sort of the whole pattern we have of consuming and our lack of stewardship responsibility to the natural systems, people that are going to get hit first and worst are the poorest of the poor in the developing parts of the world. And so it is more than just a letter to all people about climate change or about global warming. It's so much more expansive than that it represents, as I said before, a worldview. He does say there's a scientific consensus around the fact of warming. He's a little softer on the causes. He talks about the human causes and our need to address those kinds of things. He also talks about soils. He talks about deforestation. The chapter on biospheres is something that I recommend everybody because he really talks about biodiversity, and the loss of biodiversity is, again, part of the impact, even some of it that's not related to change, not related to warming, but related to this failure of our own stewardship responsibility with respect to this natural system. You know a lot by the first chapter when he refers to the world as our common home, and this being a global responsibility. And again, at a time where there's a debate in this country about whether we back away from our international responsibilities and just look at how we can behave as a country that is isolated, in this whole isolationism theme that you can hear in debates in Congress when we debate a variety of different things. It's really important to understand that this is more than just about climate change and warming, but it is also about the global impacts of a variety of things that we do, and I would say things that we don't do. So with that introduction, I'm going to have the opportunity tonight to moderate this, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask our panelists to actually make I'm going to question them. And I said the first question is going to be pretty broad, pretty general, and I'll give them an opportunity to talk a little more fully, a few minutes. Then we're going to have some follow-up questions that are specific, but we're going to get to audience questions sometime in another half hour to 45 minutes. So I will tell you that it's really a pleasure to be part of this interfaith dialogue that we're going to have here tonight. We did lose Rabbi Feld, which is too bad because after this, we're all going to go to a bar, and I thought, what a great thing, man. A rabbi, Muslim imam. My wife says back, she said I could not tell that joke. Pass up that joke. Come on. So anyway, I won't, there's nothing more about a priest, a rabbi, and a politician going to a bar. But I'm going to do just some brief introductions of our group and then open it up. And then I'm going to start the questioning. David Lloyd, Buddhist, Zen teacher and author. David lectures nationally and internationally on various topics, focusing primarily on the encounter between Buddhism and modernity, what each can learn from each other. He's especially concerned about social and ecological issues. Dr. Reverend Jonathan Ellerby, he's the executive director and lead minister at the Althea Center for Engaged Spirituality. Reverend Dr. Jonathan Ellerby is the director and lead minister and teacher of the Althea Center for Engaged Spirituality here in Denver. He's the author of several successful books and CDs, including the best-selling Return the Sacred. With a PhD in comparative religion, Jonathan has traveled the world to study among more than 40 different cultural traditions, most of which were earth-based indigenous cultures. This, combined with his passion for nature mysticism, defines his work and commitment. Reverend Amanda Henderson, Executive Director of the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. Reverend Henderson is an ordained minister in the Christian church whose passion is creating space for diverse individuals and groups to grow in vibrancy and justice. She sees religious diversity as a great gift of our democracy and seeks to support and protect this vital piece of the fabric of our community through her work. Father Eustace, instructor at Regis University. He's a Jesuit like the Pope, who has a doctorate in social sciences. He comes from India with his philosophical studies. He's worked communications in Zambia, Africa, and the Vatican with Vatican Radio, and has traveled in the entourage of Pope John Paul II as a journalist. He speaks Italian and German, in which he did his theological studies, besides other Indian and African languages. He teaches at Regis and does pastoral work in the Denver Archdiocese. Muhammad Joda, a member and founder of the Colorado Muslim Society, and a friend of mine from when I was governor. It's great to see you again. He's born in Jerusalem in 1940. He graduated from Cairo University in Egypt in the School of Business and Economics in 1964. He migrated to Chicago in 1969 and then to Denver in 1971. He's the co-founder of the Colorado Muslim Society and the Islamic Center on Parker Road in Aurora. He served as Colorado Muslim Society as treasurer, president, and lastly as chairman. He served as the Muslim chaplain at the United States Air Force Academy, currently the Muslim chaplain with the Bureau of Prisons. Mr. Joda has a record of 120 lectures, speeches, presentations to different government agencies, colleges, universities, and churches. Like me, he's married and has 4 children. So, the opening question, as I said, is going to be a fairly broad question. I'm going to start with you, Father Sequeira. because there used to be an old joke that said, you know, I have two brothers, one's a Catholic priest and the other's a Jesuit. It's not such a funny joke now that the Pope's a Jesuit, right? And I'd like to ask you, both because of your work in the Vatican, your work in Zambia, a developing country that's very much at the heart of the concern the Pope expresses, sort of your own sense from the Catholic perspective, and then more specifically, what part of the Jesuit tradition informed the Pope in putting out together an encyclical that's written to all people?
Right.
Okay, let's start with what's the difference between Catholic and Jesuit? In fact, that used to be a standard joke. As soon as the first time I went, it sounded very strange when you go to the Archdiocese office and they say, "Oh, you're a Jesuit, are you Catholic?" Because they all know it's not. But I'll never forget a Brazilian priest who had gone to visit a cardinal. He'd never heard that kind of a joke because it's something you don't say. And he had come back, and I was the treasurer then of the Biblicum in Rome, and he came back and he was horrified. How can a cardinal, that was Cardinal Arinze, ask me this? Are you Catholic? Are you a Jesuit? You know. So let me explain what that is. You see, the normal way the parishes are built up, it's for the service of the people. The Jesuits have a vocation to be at the will of the needs of the church, more than in a much more general way than a person who joins the seminary, becomes a priest, and then he goes on to maybe be a bishop and then finally be a pope. So you have the popes coming generally from that kind of tradition. And the Jesuits are much freer. They're freer for the first reason that I can think of is the whole Jesuit formation. A Jesuit is not ordained just to be a priest. So the studies that he does is always much broader, much wider. And before he's ordained a priest, he's got to have at least 3 to 4 years of actual teaching or living. Louder. Okay, sorry. Oh, that means I need to be closer. Sorry.
It's also my wife who said that, so congratulations.
She doesn't tolerate your voice, huh?
No.
I got it. Thank God I'm not married. I know. So, I'm not saying that negatively. I'm just happy. In fact, so the Jesuit formation of a young man is very much broader in attitude as well as in his perspective of how he's going to deal with people. He not only deals with young kids, he deals with older people. He gets to be a mature adult before he is ordained a priest. Now we are discovering more and more that maturity is after the age of 25. Okay?
Yeah.
And no, yeah. At least that's what they say. They may discover it's even older. But the Jesuits never get ordained priests until they're around 30. So they're very mature, they're able to deal with people and understand the reality of their problems, of their lives, and that the church is not just a dispenser of sacraments, but is also one that accompanies each individual with their lives and in the way they come closer to God, rather than just giving out rules and regulations. Now, what happened in the last two, under the last two popes was, after Vatican II, there was a bit of a chaos in the church because nobody knew who was in charge and who wasn't. And in order to put order there, they began to ordain bishops who had specialized in canon law. So it was a way of implementing law or taking individuals who had been religious superiors. So you have the Archbishop Chaput, who was the religious superior of the Capuchins, and you have Archbishop Sam, who studied canon law. I'm just giving you the two areas that they took bishops from. So they knew how to control and how to organize. The one idea that was there with the Pope was he was also a Jesuit provincial. And he stood up in his own way, and he admits now that he made a lot of mistakes when he was provincial. He was very young. And so what were mistakes for the others, for the other Jesuits, were for the Pope, that's John Paul, a good thing. He stood up to the Jesuits who were living in the slums and tried to get them out. When they refused, he dismissed them from the Jesuit order. Okay? So he put on a very strong role which impressed Pope John Paul II. And so he was made an archbishop. Meanwhile, among the Jesuits, they were not clear what he was really busy about, and they thought he was unfaithful in a certain way to the members he was supposed to take care of. I'm sharing with you a lot more, okay?
We're going to ask you just to cut it short because we have four other panelists.
So his formation as a Jesuit influenced him totally. As an archbishop, he lived with the poor. As a cardinal, he did that. And strangely enough, because they thought he wasn't friendly with the other Jesuits or whatever, seemed that way, they elected him Pope, hoping that he would put order among the Jesuits. And the first thing he did was to say, I'm a son of St. Ignatius.
Yeah. So just very briefly, if you can, what about climate change, global warming, environmentalism, and the ecology, the integral ecology? Where does that flow from Jesuit training?
Okay, it flows just from understanding the situation in which the people find themselves. Wherever you are working, you need to get involved with the people who are poor. The option for the poor is one of the criterion of what it means to be a Jesuit. If you do not take the side of the poor, you just don't even belong. And in fact, it's the whole teaching of Christ, really, about the option for the poor. And so we have novices who, I was just talking to one the other day, he was given enough money to start off, but then he had to beg, literally be with the homeless for 2 weeks, distribute his money, and then go on. So now the Pope has that kind of a direction in his life. And in Zambia, for instance, we find a lot of the forests are going, the animals are being killed, the elephants are being, just slaughtered. And we keep hearing more and more, okay, there was a problem with one lion now, with the Cecil, but it's just an instance of what has been happening for the past 40 years, using very modern sort of weapons to kill the animals. And all that takes away from the local population, because their food habits are no longer there, they don't have the animals to eat, they don't have the ability to live as they used to or they would like to because of modern ways of getting rid of the animals. The waterfall, I was just thinking, I just saw a picture today of the Victoria Falls, and I used to go there all the time. When we first went, there was always plenty of water coming down the Zambezi on the Victoria Falls. The last few times you went, you may have a little stream. It's incredible how it has changed, and just from my own perspective.
I'm gonna move on to another panelist. Thank you. That's a great explanation of the spoken word. I want to pass the microphone back to Dr. Ellerby. So this is going to be a completely different perspective because the Catholic Church, for all of its virtues, is hierarchical. It's very organized. Yet the Pope, as the leader of that's recognized sort of as a world figure and has a great deal of moral authority. I want you to react to it from your perspective as somebody who comes from a place different in a hierarchical, very organized church that's got a lot of rules that are a part of it. And in your own work with indigenous peoples, your work on spiritual issues, how did you react to this encyclical after reading it and thinking about this worldview presented by the Pope?
I appreciate that you used the term different as opposed to disorganized. It was something called mysticism. And mysticism is really religious studies word for the study of consciousness. So in studying the traditions of the world, you can look at their beliefs, you can look at their rituals, but you can also examine the interior experience of the participants. This is for many modern seekers, and that means people of faith and people looking for answers outside faith traditions, this is where their focus is. It's the discovery of a personal spiritual experience and what that experience teaches them about life and being. And so that's the focus of my work, that's the focus of our center. Now, having said that, what is universal in the study, we find in the study of reported encounters of the divine, amongst very few other universal qualities, is the awareness and the absolute knowing that all things are interrelated and interconnected. And that by virtue of the nature of spirit, or God, all things are in fact one thing. And that as such, as St. Francis wrote, we are family. Brother, sun, sister, moon. And so, for the community that I represent and from my background, I would say this was astonishing, amazing, brilliantly articulate, phenomenally mystical, and far, I mean, I think that people will be reading this for decades, well, hopefully centuries to come. It articulates not only a mystical vision of spirituality, but it articulates an incredibly integrative and responsible view of science. And what it all boils down to is the simple awareness which is affirmed both in the mystical traditions of the past as well as the very best science we have today, that you cannot solve these kinds of global issues which are with a mind of divisiveness and separateness. So, in short, it was, I think, probably one of the best pieces. I mean, I haven't read the whole thing yet. It's like 84 pages. But I think it's one of the best ecological pieces I've written, both from a scientific and a spiritual perspective.
I agree. So, Reverend Henderson, talked in your bio in the introduction about the diversity of faith systems being really one of the strengths of our democracy, something that a lot of people commented on. De Tocqueville in 1830 talked about that. From your perspective, talk a little bit about how different faith systems might react to this, and to a papal encyclical that addresses something that is this mixed question of science and faith issues.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I loved in reading the encyclical how much he utilized that diversity and the biodiversity, and naming that our diversities make us stronger from the cellular level to the macroscopic planetary cosmic level. And I understand that both at that small level and in our humanity, that our diversities make us stronger, and that we need each other, each to be who we are in our own particularity, in order to be our fullest as that one humanity. So I think that at the philosophical level, he addressed it really beautifully. So in terms of how we each take this, I love that connection between the deep, philosophical thought and then the on the ground, how does this actually look in our communities? And that was one of the parts that I thought was the most radical in the encyclical, that I'm really curious to see how it plays out. Because a lot of these ideas, I absolutely, yes, and calling out the sin and immorality of our mass consumption, and the great divisions between North and South, and even within the United States, our economic divide, and how broken this system is. But when we look at, okay, how do we start to actually change that? I think that's where it comes to play in each of our communities and our faith communities. And I think that that's a very pastoral question. And in a lot of my work, I'm working with religious leaders who are leading communities who say, outside or within Colorado, they're working with people who are deeply tied to oil industry or the coal industry. I have a friend who's an Episcopal priest in Kentucky, and he said, when it comes down to it, 90% of my congregation puts food on the table because of the coal industry. So if I speak from the pulpit, this radical message that needs to be heard, how do I hold people in making those difficult changes? Because this is hard, and anybody who thinks otherwise hasn't actually started to make the changes that need to be made. Because I know I've got 3 children and a family and 2 dogs and a home, and changing our level of consumption and our lifestyle and how much I drive, those are difficult changes in our culture. So I think each of us as religious leaders within our own particular tradition meets our own people where they are, and we walk together to name the realities of the changes that need to be made and the brokenness of where we are, and we walk together through the difficult spaces of actually making those changes.
Just a follow-up, because one of the things that I think is a concern here is that some parts of the faith community have actually become divided along political lines. Or you might say some parts of the political community have used faith as a wedge. And there are people in the evangelical Christian community who are absolutely supportive of trying to figure out ways to address warming or climate change, to think about, energy transitions. But there's a segment of that community that's not among the faith community, and they often have pretty close ties to some folks in the political community. And I just want to ask you if you thought about how we might reach across those kinds of chasms on either the political side, the social side, or even the faith side, to kind of have this message in place and really have a meaningful dialogue with them.
That's a great question, and I think that that's one of the biggest issues. I mean, all of us here are diverse in our own ways in our religious ideas, but we probably share a common concern and agreement on the scientific data. The biggest divide is that ideological divide. And I feel like we need to move the conversation out of the ideological divide and name that, and I think that the Pope does this really well in the Encyclical, that this is a universal issue, that we all live in this planet. And quite honestly, it seems to me that from a conservative perspective, you would want to conserve the environment and name that some of what we name as progress is actually destroying us. So figuring out ways to move it out of that polarizing ideological divide, how to have those conversations, I think that one is experientially. And for example, last year I led a group of 25 of us, 12 adults and 13 kids, to go, and we went actually to Costa Rica and to the rainforest and got to see birds and animals and see some of that, and then went to San Jose to work in poverty areas and to start to make those connections. And on that trip, not everybody going in was a full steam ahead environmental changes happening person. But by the end, people started to see those connections. So that was a big scale. But I think that we can do that on smaller scales to start to talk about that this is a universal issue. This is not an ideological issue. One last thing, I'm talking too much, but is also to name our own. I think that we progressive do-gooders, myself, can tend to not name our own warts and shortcomings in this topic. And so starting to be honest about the places we fall short, the fact that you go to Whole Foods and buy your organic and sustainable food and it costs 3 times as much. What's that say about economic disparity and poverty? So we need to start to name our own flaws and have some humility in this conversation as well.
Maybe we should take a poll of the progressive do-gooders in the room. Are there any others? Okay, Mohammed, my experience with you has been that you are really wonderful at thinking about how to work across faith systems and how to bring about solutions. I'd be very interested in your personal reaction to the Encyclical, but also the Islamic community in Colorado that you're so familiar with, what the community's reaction has been to this Encyclical by the Pope.
Well, thank you. I would like to start with a very short prayer, if you don't mind, please. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Almighty God, the most gracious, the most merciful, creator and the sustainer of the heavens and the earth, the Lord of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, may peace and blessing on them. Amen.
Amen.
Beside my biography that you presented also, I would like to add, I born in Jerusalem, so I'm a Palestinian by birth, Muslim by faith, American by free choice, and Republican by compulsion. No offense for fellow Republicans. Well, the Muslim community, specifically in the state of Colorado, they are not much aware of this, I would like to call it the Papal Declaration for the 21st century. And it is a declaration being made for all faiths and for all government and for every individual one. The Holy Quran is full of verses that God created this earth for us in the most beautiful way we can think of or imagine. And He created man also in the most beautiful shape to be in. And He made man on this earth the vicegerent of God, or the trustee of God. And we all know what is the responsibility of a trustee person in a college or university or any fund of that, to keep it good and to make it grow to the best. So that's what it is. And in the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, and this is, they call it the final revelation, the word fasad, which is corruption or wrongdoing, it's been mentioned more than 55 times in the Quran, and it applies to the corruption among people themselves, bribery to the people in offices or government, and also apply to throwing a stone on the sidewalk of the street, or throwing a banana peel in the street. This is also considered fasad or corruption we are committed on the earth. In the creation, at the start of the creation, God created Adam, and He make the angels bow to Adam to show how much noble is this human being is. He get nobility above all other creature God may created. And He put him on earth, which is the most beautiful planet in the universe. And He make him, like I said, the vicegerent of God on earth, to keep it in the best that He received it and deliver it at the end the best as it could be. The responsibility of man on this earth to keep it to the best it can be, green in the color, water clean, food is available and sustainable for people, sustainable energy for people without any pollution or destruction. All these things being very much emphasized in the Holy Quran. And the word science came too close here, because last week, me and Amanda was in a panel discussion, and the rabbi, he asked, how many has trouble, adjusting science with religion? Almost everybody raised his hand. To myself, there's so many scientific statements in the Quran that it's even the modern science not get close to it. And I can give lecture on that, science in the Quran or in Islam. And the Muslim civilization in Spain speak to that, which is the most advanced civilization ever been built at that time. And the roots of European Renaissance, it goes back to the Islamic universities in Spain. So with this brief I hope I could I covered some of the aspects of the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. David, I invited you to go last just because as a Buddhist I knew you'd be patient. I'm a big fan of Thomas Merton. I don't know if you know him, but he's probably the most prominent Catholic writer in the 20th century and really a student of Buddhism. And in fact, he met sort of an untimely death when he left Kentucky, his monastery, and went to Asia really to understand more deeply the practice of Buddhism. And So I'd like you to think for the audience, or describe for the audience, your own sense about this encyclical, but as a Buddhist and as a person who understands sort of Buddhist way and Buddhist thought, how you react to this when you see this encyclical and when you see the Pope and the Catholic Church as the one who addressed it.
Well, as you can imagine, the basic Buddhist worldview is quite different from that of Catholicism, and yet they intersect in some very interesting and important ways. For Buddhism, the important issue isn't good guys against bad guys, but the basic question is really delusion versus wisdom, or ignorance versus enlightenment, awakening, and so forth. And probably the most problematic form of delusion is our sense of separation, which takes a number of different forms. I mean, separation from each other, along with the idea that somehow my well-being is separate from your well-being. Separation of groups, maybe men versus women, white people against people of color, and also, most generally today, of course, a separation, sense of separation and alienation of humanity as a whole and its relationship with the rest of the earth. And what I find really powerful about the encyclical is the way that, in his own language, the Pope is emphasizing all of these. The other side of the delusion of separation is the wisdom, the realization of our interdependence.
When I read the encyclical, and even I'm in Rome, we had a great deal of discussion about how we measure growth around the world. And of course, you may know the story that they asked, a group of economists asked a fellow economist to try and put out an index for growth that was later called the gross national product, and then finally the gross domestic product. And the one thing he said is, never really use this as an indicator of progress. And what did we do? We turned around and used it as the indicator of progress around the world. Bobby Kennedy said there's nothing about GDP that actually measures well-being of a human being. And when I read the Pope's encyclical, what came to mind is that Bobby Kennedy was really presaging that someday we would have to come to grips with the fact that not only does gross domestic product not measure well-being on an individual basis, even on sort of a global basis, we have come to a place of gross global inequality as a result of using that as our foremost indicator of growth. So with that, we're going to go to questions.